Welcome to Beyond the Surface. We highlight unique voices in architecture and design. We share their stories to uncover who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez. Today's episode is called Who Are You Speaking to with our guest, Rana Lee. Rana is marketing principal, leading business development for HOK's Chicago studio. With 30 years of experience in architecture, design, and real estate industry, she develops business strategies and coaches high-performance team with a client-centric approach. Rana is a member of the HOK's marketing board. A recognized community leader, in the past, Rana has served on several civic and professional boards, including the Forest Preserve Foundation, Lambda Alpha International, and the Chicago Central Area Committee. She is a founding board member and past DEI committee chair of the Professional Women in Construction Chicago chapter. Rana is a trustee on the AIA Chicago Foundation Board, and in 2023, Crane Chicago Business named her a notable leader in DEI. Thank you for being here with us, Rana. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. We've heard a lot about you through Emily and through some of our research we've done. So I'm excited to get this conversation going. So,
Yeah,
how are you feeling today?
I'm feeling great. Thank you for having me. I'm really interested in what we're going to explore together. And I have enjoyed listening to some of the prior podcasts that you've sent me, some of whom include many of my friends. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
All right, well, let's get this conversation going. I'm excited to be able to learn more about your role, especially since we have yet to interview someone who has a closer tie to marketing. But before we get into your role, I want to know about your journey, your background. So, can you tell us a little bit about your early life and how you grew up?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. So my story starts in Seoul, South Korea. My parents emigrated in the late 60s. I was born here, so I'm first generation. I grew up here in Chicago, and my father was a worker in the manufacturing business, and my mother was a registered nurse. Grew up on the north side, and very much a what I would reflect back on a traditional immigrant story, working hard, grew up in the city. And then one of the things that was struck me, and I think that has been an influence in my whole life, is the fact that they bought a three flat very early on. And we lived in one unit and they rented out the other two. And I remember on weekends when other kids went out to play, my parents were like, okay, we have to vacuum the common area, we have to mow the lawn. And so there's so many things that resonate with me. I also didn't speak English as my first language growing up, probably up until kindergarten, and I went to school and got made fun of and all that stuff. And so fast forward to today, there's a lot about my Korean language skills that are stunted at the kindergarten level. I'm embarrassed to say, but I'm working on it. So when I grew up, my parents wanted me not to struggle, and so they had predetermined that I would be an accountant. One of my dad's closest friends was a CPA, and my dad's philosophy is no matter if the economy's good or bad, people always need to file taxes. And I'm going to give the gift of job security to my daughter. So you fast forward, I go to University of Illinois and I take some accounting classes. I was also miscategorized. I went in as liberal arts, but for whatever reason, all my core requirements were tied to the engineering curriculum, including calculus. And I think it was at that point I learned that I can't do math. I might be the only Asian, nevertheless South Korean, who cannot do math. So quickly realized that going through and getting my CPA wasn't in the cards. I didn't know what I wanted to do after school. I'm not sure if most people going to college know where their path is going to lead them. So I had to quickly pivot, and what I realized was in accounting, I couldn't understand when someone asked, explain depreciation of a company, of a stock, and it was so conceptual to me. And so I still wanted to graduate on a 4-year plan. So I quickly found a curriculum where I could have a lot of my core classes transfer over, and that was in real estate. And interestingly, when depreciation was taught, I thought back about my parents' three flat, and I can tangibly understand what depreciation means because you could see a building or things go through wear and tear. So I graduated, and it was really bad economy. The vacancy rate for office buildings in Chicago was 22%. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see it more than that, but that's where we're sitting today. We're almost 30% office vacancy. And I applied to every real estate company possible, even things that I didn't understand. And I ended up in a role as an appraisal analyst, which is kind of funny because as someone who doesn't do math really well, is now charged with doing 10-year cash flow pro formas, returns, working with numbers all day, sitting behind a computer. And that was the one thing that I knew I never wanted to do. I told my parents, I don't want to have a job where I'm sitting behind a computer. I said to them, I go, well, I want to be in management. I didn't know what that was. And I remember vividly my parents saying to me, are you sure? It's really difficult. We can't help you. We don't know anybody who does management to help you, but we know lots of CPAs. So if you want to go back and, return to your CPA studies, we're happy to help you. So nevertheless, I persisted, and that started a 15-year career in real estate investments and finance.
I like how you started your story about buying the three flat because that was like a huge thing that happened. And I feel like it almost influenced where you were then when you were doing real estate. So can you talk about what that three flat meant to you, especially when buying that property? And if you can talk about also more about how you felt entering real estate and that connection you had to real estate.
Yes. So when my parents bought the three flat, I think it was first grade, I want to say through fourth grade. So very formative time in my life. And I don't know to what extent that's influenced me, but it's certainly a through line in my career. When my parents bought the three plat, we were the only immigrants, at least Asian immigrants I could tell in the neighborhood. And I saw them working so hard. Not only their 9 to 5 jobs, raising 2 kids, navigating a still a foreign culture, but how hard they worked and everything they had to do from, I remember my dad said we have to mop the basement floor where the washing machines and the storage lockers were. And I go, I don't understand. Nobody goes down there, and, he talked about caring for things you own. Now, not in the literal sense, but it transpired, and it was very clear this was not only our home, but this was a pathway to something bigger for my family's future. And I reflect back and think I don't know how they did it. If I reflect back, if I were their age coming through, it's really remarkable. So I think from there, it's this notion of this immigrant hard work ethic, doing your best, wanting to provide for a different way of life for your family, but also the entrepreneurial spirit. There's so many immigrant populations who come to this city and this country where they just come with this grit and this resilience. And I can definitely say I have that, to really build my life story. So yeah, I think for me, that purchase of the three flat was not so much I'm going to go into real estate, but what it means to work hard and what it means to sacrifice.
I like that response a lot. So when you started really getting into real estate, did your urge for management start to go away?
No, when I got into real estate, I want to tell you my first assignment, which really, as I sit here, I'm reflecting back all these years later. So I worked for a pension fund advisor who owned a lot of investment real estate around the country. And my job in the appraisal department was to work with the team and evaluate each property and what it was worth today. So my first job assignment, they led me to the conference room. 3/4 of that conference room was filled with bankers' boxes. And my job, I think for the first month at least, was reading all those leases. Okay, and I remember going through one box, and the anchor tenant was a department store, large department store. And I go, oh my goodness, I'm getting to the end of the box. Just to realize they did a renewal, and that was the next 2 boxes. And I just remember wow, this is how you really begin to understand a company. This is really how you begin to understand in a shopping center why certain tenants are in certain places. There's a reason why Orange Julius or those fast food places, Auntie M's, is right there in the corner, and how they negotiated those leases and some of the provisions they had. So, for example, if you were a retailer of teenage casual clothing, they had in their provision that no other competitor can be on that wing with them. And so, after you read a conference room full of boxes, you quickly realize, wow, this is a little different than the three flat lease my mom and dad used for a tenant. And I would say that I was never really interested in the real estate as an asset class. I was really more intrigued about how deals got done, how negotiations happened. And so, to answer your question, my first job and my first assignment, I think, made me want to learn more about management. But, you got to remember, when you take management business classes in college, it's theoretical and it doesn't necessarily translate to the real life. So I stayed in that job for a year because I got called back to a company that was my first choice. And I did more investment real estate analysis. And it was never about, again, the real estate. It was more about, why are they selling this portfolio of industrial buildings around the country? What were the questions asked that the answer was, we have to sell this portfolio? And then it was, how do you structure that deal? Then it was, how do you negotiate? How do you determine which deal points you were going to hold on to and get the deal done? So for me, it was all about the strategy of getting from point A to point B. It was never about the real estate. And it's kind of funny thinking back on that.
I like the way that you put it, like how you talked about real estate and having like more of the urge to be more in business, and how you said you started to see things come together, understand why things were built in a certain way because of business. But one thing is that even after you started doing more business strategy, you stayed in the built environment. How did business strategy start to develop while you were in your career?
Yeah, so in my first career in investment real estate and finance, I mentioned very early on I didn't understand. It was too much of a struggle for me to stay in the analyst role because I knew very quickly that math didn't come naturally to me. But when I looked at those reports and pro formas, I could see like, oh, this number means this. Then as a company or as an owner, we need to be thinking about these things. So the numbers became an inflection point. Okay, what does that mean? How do I counsel clients? How do I counsel the broker? But as my career progressed, I mean, I had so many amazing experiences. I evolved in my role as an analyst. I decided, oh, there's an opportunity to go into management. And I think a lot of women, especially, will say, I don't have all the job requirements, so I'm not going to apply. But I went and talked to the investment manager for a whole region. And I said, tell me about this job. I said, wow, I think I could do that. I'm interested in that. And so I applied. And, lo and behold, I'm in my first, I guess, quote unquote, management role, even though it was very early on. I learned about goals, business goals. I learned about people, about how to create change, how to mobilize a group who may not disagree with you to still make a contribution in a way that's authentic to who they are. I learned how to manage investors, outside investors. I learned how to manage up, manage down. I mean, that was my MBA class in management. So from there, I moved with the company and I had the ability to run my own region. There was a series of organizational changes in that company, and the person who was supposed to train me in that region, his role shifted and now he was reporting to me. So it was a really awkward time, but I learned, still another life lesson. How do you manage something that you didn't ask for, that you're uncomfortable with? It was a real struggle, but there's so many things that I learned from that lesson. Then I ran a line of business around the country, and it was really about, how do you mobilize people to understand the business strategy and work with them to design a way in which to accomplish those goals. And then also there's a whole external client aspect. I seem to make a job change every time there's a bad economy. And I don't do that on purpose. It just seems that way. But in '06, a client of ours asked if I would join their firm to raise money. So my job was to go to wealthy individuals, ask them for an investment so that we could turn around and assemble a portfolio in multifamily around the country. And I said, I've never done this before. Why not? And at that point in my career, I was an analyst, assistant regional manager, ran a line of business. After leading all these individuals and groups around the country, I go, you know what? I'm going to be a broker because I've never been a broker. And how can I guide these people if I don't have the experience? So in my 30s, I was a investment broker on straight commission. So I was a seller doer my entire career, including when I was at the private equity firm. And I was structuring deals, which I never thought I would be doing. I was hiring the people that I trained to work for us to sell our portfolio. And that was also interesting. I had a front row seat on how to negotiate, when to walk away from a deal, and when to just say, you know what, this doesn't make sense, but this is what I want to go after. So there were so many things in my career that really informs the role I have today.
You have said that every single time you've made a job change, it was during a tough economy. Tell me a little bit more about your job change in 2006.
Yeah, so I was working at this private equity firm raising money. And at the time, we saw indicators in the economy where we were going to go into a recession. For the listeners out there, the area of business that I was in is well ahead of when someone decides I need to hire an architect to plan this community or this building. So very early, high up on the deal cycle. And they decided that they were going to not raise money anymore. They didn't feel good about taking investor money for the sake of taking the money and doing a deal, because how that industry works is the more money you invest and the more you return, the more money you get the following year. Okay, so it almost has this self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that company decided we're not doing that. We're going to sleep at night, and we got yelled at by investors. How dare you return our money when we could be doing something else? So I left, I took a year off, and I just really reflected on, what am I doing? Like in more of a metaphorical way versus, an existential crisis. It's like, wow, okay, so I've seen on the investment side all different roles there is to have. How do I feel about this? Is this really all there is? And I was so lucky that I had great mentors and I did well in my career. And so I just really took a year off, like, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And is real estate, more importantly, the place for me? And so I'm going to tell a quick story, but it took me a long time to figure it out. I said, what are the attributes of an environment, a company, where I'm going to do my best work? So yeah, you have to have honesty, integrity, all those things. And I said, wow, I am looking for a place that values innovation, collaboration, and the pursuit of excellence. Now, I said it took me a year to figure that out. And then I went back and reflected on my career and the types of roles and the types of companies I was at. And I realized, oh my goodness, I'm lucky if I get one of those things for part of the day. And so at that point in I call my gap year, I was looking for another real estate company, investment company to join. And when I realized, wow, the real estate industry at that time for me didn't align with the core values that I was looking for, where I said I would do my best work. And so that allowed me to look at other industries. And a friend of mine said, well, I know of an architecture firm and they're looking for a business development person. And I remember saying to her, I have never heard of that company. By the way, they're a national big firm. And then I said, what is business development? Never heard of that role. And she said to me, these are people who create relationships, open the door, and help bring the work in. Okay, well then who does the work? Well, the rest of the studio. And I remember saying, this is a job? This is amazing. Because my entire career, I was a seller doer, meaning I had to go find my own work and then do the work. So to think, in my 30s that there's a job where people are classified according to where their strengths are. When I look back on my investment career, I didn't really care about the deal or the assets. I was more curious about the motivators and how to structure to get to where we wanted to go. And the contract was a means to the end. So I went for an interview, several. And the first thing I noticed is, wow, these architecture firms, and they were big firms that I went to for my first interview, it is so quiet in these offices. This is really weird. And then I would sit in the lobby waiting for someone to come by and get me. And I would just observe, and I was just picking up on the ambient clues of people walking by. Do they say hello to the receptionist? Do they give a nod to each other? And I was like, oh. So I'm scanning for ambient clues to determine, is this a place that reflects the three things that I'm looking for? Innovation, pursuit of excellence, collaboration. And I go, wow, you know what? I better go talk to other design firms to see if they too have a quiet environment. Because where I came from, it was just very collaborative. You're always strategizing. You're always workshopping through situations. So I continued on, and I'll never forget, I think it was my third interview, and the partners asked me, well, you know, our studio right now, we have a strong portfolio in healthcare. What do you know about healthcare? And essentially, they wanted to know, how quickly can you bring in work that's healthcare focused? And I was sitting there like, my God, this is my third interview. We've had some really nice conversations. I've told them about my whole career. I've done retail, multifamily, office, industrial. Never did I ever say covered healthcare or the medical field. And they asked me the question, so who do you know? What is your strategy for getting us into the healthcare market? And I looked at the partners and I said, well, I know that my doctor is at Northwestern Medicine and I have Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance. And it was dead silent afterwards. But what was I going to do? They would have found out. I mean, I'm sure they read my resume and they knew that healthcare wasn't there. And after the pause, I said to them, you're telling me that this position exists because you have experts in this area called healthcare, yet you have problems of growing market share and understanding the best way to message and position your differentiators to get in the door. I don't have healthcare experience, but my entire career is based on how do you grow the market? How do you move people in alignment with your goal and your strategy? I know what makes deals happen, or in this case, interactions or relationships. So if you tell me that you have all the experts in healthcare, I don't need to know healthcare. My job is to go in and listen, understand for the things that keep these clients up at night, come back and translate to the technical team how we might position some of our differentiators to go back in. And so I kind of make the analogy, my job in the world of creating relationships, I said to the partners, I go, I'm the warm-up act. I get the audience primed, pumped up for the main act. I kind of figure out where there's pockets of, oh, they're not jiving to this. I might change my song. But my job is to get the client excited about the technical expertise or the partner that I'm bringing who knows XYZ to talk about what he or she has seen. So I'm looking at myself more as that translator for the client in-house. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but I couldn't just give you a quick 10-second, here's how I did it.
Can you talk a little bit more about business development and its role in architecture and design?
There's a real disconnect in the built environment, specifically design firms I'm going to speak to because that's my lived experience. People don't understand what business development means. For some people, it's meaning, oh, glad handing, I'm salesy. Another one will say, I didn't go to design school to market, or that's someone else's job. And there's so many things, but I think there's two things. One is in my past career and in the realm that I was dealing with, no one cares about design in terms of buildings and so on and so forth. They care about design in the sense of how do I design a strategy to get to my return? But I'm so far upstream on the capital market side that, I mean, even when I was an investment sales broker, My job, I sold office buildings in the suburbs. Nobody cares about the design, at least in the part of the transaction that I'm involved in. And by the time someone came to me and say, "Oh, we're going to hire an architect," that was a signal that I had overstayed the time I was supposed to be in that sector or in that transaction, right? So then I shift over into the design field. And again, my role hasn't changed. It's growth strategy. And instead of talking about office buildings, shopping centers, and so on, we're talking about market sectors, healthcare, aviation, sports, et cetera. And the emphasis, of course, is so on design. But I do think that I know we're sitting here at IIT, the hallowed halls of architecture in Chicago. I'm going to say something controversial. I believe that architecture curriculums do their students a disservice by only focusing on the craft. And I say that with great respect. Architects come out of school and it's about precision, it's about final, it's about perfection, it's about technical accuracy. But in the real world, you need to be able to convey the story behind the design, why your firm is better than someone else, or when you're interviewing for a job, why am I a better candidate than John, Mary, George, etc. And it is not selling. I think there's a big misunderstanding about business development. And I found that I had to start every role that I had in architecture with this foundational notion of whatever you think business development is, throw it out the window. It's three things. This is not Rana Lee's definition. This is what business development means in the investment world, in the business world. Business development is the creation of a long-term sustainable growth strategy through three things: people, markets, and clients. So you have to understand the people who are in this ecosystem, their motivators, their detractors. You got to know the market. How can you be an aviation specialist if you don't know the trends in aviation, which implies you need to be out there, the trends, so on. Passenger behavior has changed. How does that influence the design of airports, right? So you have to be in the market. And then last thing is clients. If you don't understand your clients, how can you create or design for them the solution, right? So I think the notion of architecture, architecture is a craft, as is business development. Business development is a design problem. How do you go out and find work? It's no different than what should we do on this 5-acre site? And when my colleagues, I mentioned this when I go, what do you do when you come upon a 5-acre site? And they're like, I don't know, that's a big question. Where do you want me to start? I go, do you just plop a building down? They go, no. They might say, we look at topography, we look at the natural opportunities and constraints of the site. We're going to ask the client, what sort of sustainability goals do you have? Because if they say, oh, we want to, emulate passive house characteristics, well, that's going to inform how you design in your siting. All those things are the same considerations that I have when I go and decide what is our go-to-market strategy, what is our differentiators, who is our buyers, what is their affinity, and who else is doing this, right? And so I wish architecture schools would do that, to include classes or bring in folks to do that, because I think they're setting them up for a better future. And one of the things that I do is people are very uncomfortable with networking. Okay, and I go, don't think about it as networking as sales. You're just having a conversation with someone. Networking is about generosity, it's about listening. And I think also this is where there's a disconnect between the craft of architecture as a discipline and business development. As I mentioned earlier, I could simplify things and say architects are trained about perfection, the output, the deliverable. Yeah, the process is important, but it's upon reacting to the object, building, place, or space. And when I say object, I don't mean any disrespect to everything that's gone into doing that. When you look at that, it's very visual, very aesthetic driven. In business development or in networking, I have no idea what the final design is going to look like. And the only way that I can start to imagine what that looks like is by being curious, asking questions, and getting to know whoever it is I'm speaking to. And if you're classically trained as an architect, that's not something that's brought forward, celebrated, or encouraged.
Architecture school first is definitely not perfect. I feel like you don't really know what architecture is until you're thrown out into the field. And I think you described like business school similarly. Everything's theoretical. You only really get taught like a few phases of what actually goes on in architecture in the real world. So I can understand what you mean by that because there needs to be a bigger push for more of the business side, or at least understanding the importance of it. And while you were talking, it made me think about the way architecture is presented differently to designers versus to clients or who you're trying to get work with. So, would you be able to talk about how marketing presents architecture differently than a designer would?
When you're out in a networking environment or you're talking to other architects or non architects, they'll ask, Alex, tell me what you're working on. Maybe you'll say, I'm working on a 275,000 gross square foot engineering building for this university. And we're focused on sustainability goals. We're targeting LEED Platinum. And we have got all these sorts of cool whiz bang something technologies, okay? And as a marketer, when I hear that, I say, well, technically it's correct. And my response to you is, so what? You know, I asked you, what are you working on? And your answer is absolutely correct. But as a marketer or as a layperson, first, okay, well, let's just start with networking. Everything you said, like, I don't know how to react to as a listener. Like, oh, okay, that's great. Maybe I'll say, if I have courage, tell me more. Okay, but you didn't give me something as a listener to kind of grab onto and ask a follow-up question. Okay, so that's just in a networking sense. So when I put my marketer hat on and I evaluate the response the designer gave, I say, so what? You talked about the facts and the figures. You didn't talk about the impact. And ultimately, everything we do as humans is about impact, reaction, and response. So you're designing this building. Okay, so what's the impact to that university, that program, the student population? And my colleagues will say that one of my favorite questions is, so what? When we're getting ready for an interview prep for a large assignment, they'll say, oh, here are the statistics about energy efficiency. And they go the next slide and they talk about, solar performance. And I go, so what? One of the things I would say is, give me something to grab onto. Give me the headline, okay? So let me use that same example. Alex, oh my God, I'm so excited. One of the projects I'm working on is a very large engineering school for this university. This university is top 5 in the country. And right now they do their programming in 7 different buildings across 3 different campuses or neighborhoods on a mega campus. And notwithstanding that, they're top 5 in the country. What this building is going to do is to create a home for all engineering students. And not only that, all freshmen as a cohort will go through this hall for their foundational learning. Okay, like, can I ask you, Alex, like, how does that land on you? Did that sound a little more interesting?
In the beginning, it was a little dense, but afterwards, I started to like understand like what the building was for, what the impact was. So,
Yeah, and similarly, when I hear a designer talk about that building and they start talking about program square footage, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have the same reaction. It's dense. But you have to understand, like, who's your audience? Okay, and when that person leaves after you've given them, oh, I'm working on this building, what do you want them to remember? The square footage, the building that you're designing it, the university? I want people to remember the power of what design can do.
yeah, so you were just talking about what people will remember when you're having a conversation. So, could you talk about the importance of networking and the purpose of it?
Oh, one of my favorite topics, networking. Okay, so let me just kind of step back and realize, like, I had to understand when I joined the design firm and began my career in architecture, why is networking so difficult for people? because I came from an industry where we were trained how to do that. I had great training because it was sales. And one of the things, as I referenced earlier, is architects are trained in technical competency, not relational fluency. They know how to solve a problem, but they may not know how to start a conversation. So I say this when people go to a networking event, I'll say, Alex, would you ever consider going into a client meeting? Let's say it's design review, or your team needs to get some decisions from the client. Do you go into that meeting cold and unprepared and not having game planned with your team of how the meeting's going to go? Okay, so why would you do that for networking? And I really ask architects and designers, you know the framework. You know the framework. So I'm going to a networking event, and let's say it's a NOMA networking event. I may not be familiar, so I'm going to do some research. What is NOMA about? What is the impact they want to make? Who are the members? That's the same as understanding the site. Okay, then I'm going to go, oh, I think I'm going to look up some of the bios of those on the board or committee chairs. Okay, those are like user group meetings. So I may decide going into this meeting, your design review meeting, okay, in networking, and I say, okay, you know what, the goal of this meeting is to understand how some of my younger colleagues at the office might become more active or join. Okay. So when I go to that meeting, that's my goal. So I'm going to talk to people like, Alex, I'm not familiar with NOMA. I've done my research. I think this is something that would resonate with some of my colleagues. Can you help me? What inspired you to join? Right. So I am networking with intention. And I tell everybody two of the reasons you really have a hate relationship with networking is one, you don't ever practice. And number two, you don't have a goal. Networking is a skill. Just like those who have gone to design school, you go in knowing nothing. You are taught a skill so that you can own your craft. And I also mentioned you don't ever talk about networking or how to create relationships in design school. Well, it is so imperative, right? And then as architects, you go to a studio to practice the theory that you've learned. Networking is the same. And whoever said practice makes perfect, I think it's practice builds confidence. Practice builds confidence. When you are in studio and you're using that X-Acto knife and you cut yourself every time you do a certain move, you learn after a while, maybe I should change my technique. You know through practice that if you do it a certain way, you could harm yourself or, bleed and you don't want to bleed on the model, God forbid. And so in networking, I say, hey, you need to know 3 skills. 1, how to join a conversation, especially when you see a group of people. Number 2, you need to know how to introduce someone. Yourself, of course, but also if someone's joining the group, you want to make them feel welcome. And then lastly, how to exit a conversation. And so I have done all of these networking sessions, workshops, and so on. And here's what I found. People don't engage in networking because of their fear of being stuck in a conversation, or they feel very uncomfortable making eye contact with someone. And this is particularly true with earlier careerists who are more accustomed to doing work or communicating via screen. And so if you are networking and you do not set a goal, you are wasting your time.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone explain networking the way you have. And I've taken a few networking classes and little seminars here and there, and I feel like the way you described it was an approach of an architecture person. You really know how to explain it to someone who does architecture, but you also made me realize things that happen in networking that I never realized, like speaking with purpose. I've always found it easier to speak when I have a reason to, rather than if I'm just at an event just to be at an event. And you talked about being prepared, which is something that I feel like not many people do. You have all this knowledge. How have you shared it with other people through mentorship or leadership roles?
There's so many ways. I go to work every day and I think about my office or the studio as a lab. And I really go about helping people accelerate where they are or their skill set through the lens of they've never done this before and having empathy for them. And instead of saying, oh, I can't believe that person went to the networking event and just wasting time. And, if I don't ever share that in a constructive way, plus I have to get anchored. Well, again, going back to design and my desire to understand people, what does that person know or what support or coaching has been provided to them that they show up this way? So it might have been bad coaching. It might have been no coaching, most likely, if we're thinking about it. So I really try to meet people where they're at. I don't try to get through their head. Networking is not sales. I can say that till I'm blue in the face, but that is a belief that is so valid to them, and I'm not interested in changing it. I'm interested in opening the aperture 2 degrees and showing them other examples. I'm interested in expanding their understanding of what networking is. And so how is that manifested? I told you I do networking workshops. It is so common that everyone goes to networking events, small ones, large ones, and they just stand there. Help them navigate it. So actually simulate a networking event with name tags, with strangers, with beverages and food. We practice joining a conversation, making an introduction, exiting a conversation, and we also practice setting goals. So for example, after the first simulation, I'll ask, what was an area you struggled with in that 5-minute simulation? And you might say, exiting the conversation. And I'll say, Alex, for the next simulation, I want you to specifically focus on getting comfortable exiting the conversation, and I'd like you to do that 5 times. Okay, so you do the same thing. I'll say, Alex, how was that compared to round 1? And hopefully you said it got a little easier, but also I'm going to give you tips of how to do that. Not just make you do it, but I'm going to give you the foundational tips that will help guide your success. I do this for lots of different organizations. I also do this for emerging leaders. So I'm involved in Chicago Women for Architecture, their Ladders to Leadership program to help mid-level career women get to ownership or principal status, whatever their goal is. At my firm, what I do is I have BD study hall. And so once a month almost, it's, bring your own lunch and we talk about some aspect of business development. Think of a charrette. 10 minutes of here's the framework. We're going to talk about how to introduce yourself today. And we'll go around and we workshop. Or someone has asked me, hey, how do projects come in the door? And I meet people where they're at. And so I'm going to use the framework that they're familiar with, the design process. Okay, when we talk about design development, this is what that means in business development. When we talk about 70% CDs, I think that's right. By the way, I don't ever think we told your listeners, I'm not an architect. I don't even pretend to be one on TV. And in fact, when I first started, I think for the first 5-6 years, I didn't even know the proper sequence of design phases. I knew that in the beginning, you have a visioning session, and at the end, there's a ribbon cutting, and everything in the middle was kind of a mystery to me. But here's the deal. I have experts who can help me, partner with me. Okay, we're in design develop. This is what it means. This is what it is, right? And similarly, I kind of help them. Here's how we can level up your client presentation. So I started this by saying, I go in the office, the studio is a lab. So I tell young people and experienced people, there are so many ways every day you can create safe simulations to level up your skill set. Don't think of it as networking, just level up your skill set. How often are you asked to present in studio? Talk about the project you're working on and what stage is it at. You could start with, okay, we're in DD, we're blah, blah, blah. The client said this, but you can also say it in a way that you're practicing how to talk about that project in front of a group of people. Okay, just to anchor everyone who may not be familiar, the project is this. Here are the client goals. Here's where we are. We're in DD, right? So you just kind of gave people context to grab on, because you got to understand, if you're in a studio that has multiple projects or multiple markets, unless they're working on your project, they don't know what your project is about. I also tell people, if you're in a large office, use the microphone. Because when you go out in public and you're at an event, you may ask a question, or if you're in an interview and it's a large group, you may be asked to use a lapel microphone. And unless you know how to use it, you're going to be focused on that and it's going to impact your presentation delivery, right? So using every day in the office to practice, and that's how I do it. I do it in formal ways, I do it in informal ways. One of my colleagues is putting together an alumni, I think it's an alumni kind of panel. They have a strong alumni group and they go to different places every quarter and they talk about things related to design. And she goes, hey, I'm doing this. Can you help me? And people think that putting on an event is easy peasy. It's design. The event starts the moment that they get first word or first email about it. The event ends not at 5 o'clock when when the session's over. It ends after you capitalize on the momentum of the event. So when I was speaking with her, I go, what is this about? Who is your audience, right? I'm doing that, understanding the site. What do these people want to hear? What are their expectations, right? Okay, there's owner program requirement. What is the message you want to have? What is the one thing you want them to remember about the event, about our firm, about you? Oh, I don't know. Well, how can you design a building without understanding design intent, right? You know what the design framework is. Use that as a guide, right? And so she came back, she goes, okay, I got it. Okay, so we got some big concepts. We got 4 different concepts. I go, okay, what were you thinking here? How does that support your design intent? And just literally going through that crit process. She took 2, pushed them together, and is going into detailed concepts and looking at, and she came back, she goes, okay, how's this? And I go, okay, so you have these 3 presenters. What do each of those presenters, what is their design ethos? How is that going to contribute to the conversation? Are they all aligned? Because a panel is not really interesting if everyone agrees. So you need one point of disruption or an outside thinker, right? And so these are things that you naturally do as architects and designers. I'm just taking that framework and applying it to something different. So if I were an architect, I'd be a conceptual designer and I better have a really good PA, technical architect, to make sure that my designs can actually be done. But that's how I do it, just really keeping it real and meeting people where they're at.
It's just been interesting to just even listen to the way you think.
Well, it's no different than what I hear from my designers. I'm just applying it in a different way. And, going back to this colleague who was preparing this event, she goes, wow. And I said to her, I go, do you know what your role is as the moderator? And she goes, I feel like this is a trick question, but knowing you, it's not. And I said, as the moderator of a panel, you only have one job. It's to make the panelists look great. You're curating that. And everything from down to, okay, there's the event, which might be 60 minutes, and then there's the panel, which might be 45. Who owns the event? What are they going to say in remarks? Who owns the panel? How are you going to do this going back and forth? And I said to her, I go, okay, we're now in construction documentation, okay? Use that as a framework, okay? And she's like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe how much thought goes into putting together a great event. And I say, I think strategy is design. And the area I focus in is growth strategy. You only know that strategy is missing when it's bad design. You know what I'm saying?
That's true. We're coming to the end of the episode, so to wrap up, can you give us a little bit more advice on what architects should know about how to have confidence when they talk about themselves?
Practice. Practice builds confidence, not practice builds perfect. So if you never put yourself out there, you're playing it not only safe, you're not playing, period. If I try to design a building and have it be built without having any architecture training, I'm going to fail. There's going to be so many points where they say, that's not, you can't do that, this is not code, whatever. Practice. One of the things that I do, I've been doing it for probably the last 10 years, is I have a hobby. It used to be a summer hobby. I don't have time in the summer, so I pick a different season. And I choose a hobby that I know nothing about. And I do that not for technical mastery, not even foundational understanding. I do that to remember what it's like to be a beginner. I've done it scuba diving, I've done fantasy football, I've done making and preserving jams, to drumming. And it's so painful for me to not be good at something because Monday through Friday, I do something that I'm really good at called my job. And just understanding and being humble about, wow, okay, right? And I would say to people, practice, be comfortable being uncomfortable, whether that is introducing yourself, exiting a conversation, talking about your design without waiting to be asked. If you wait to be asked for your opinion, how does that translate into networking? So use every day to find the areas where you're a little uncomfortable and lean into it, because we all start as beginners and you don't ever evolve until you have comfort in working through the areas of discomfort. So be uncomfortable is my advice.
I like that advice. It's not easy to be uncomfortable.
Oh, I know. That's why I started doing this hobby thing, because it's uncomfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah. But it's necessary, it builds. But well, thank you for being on this podcast. I have one more question before we let you go. Do you have any future goals?
Yeah, it's the one that I've been working on for the last, 5 years. I am so focused right now on helping accelerate the next generation of leaders. I have a special place in my heart for women leaders or mid-career women, underserved people, and I just think about how can I use my role, where I am, my agency, to help open doors for them, make it a little easier, tell them, hey, you're just fine. Your journey is just normal. That's why I tell people very early on, hey, I'm first generation. English wasn't my first language. I got you. Let me help you. And what you're doing, you're right on track. Let me give you advice. And I really try not to teach or lecture at them. In university, it's what I call the park and bark. You sit, you park yourself. Is the professor going to bark at you? That doesn't work. I want to do it alongside of them. I find ways to work with them, workshop with them, be a co-conspirator like this woman where I mentioned she was working on a panel. Because I learned too. And I think it's really great. And that's kind of what I'm focused on. This is why I joined the AIA Foundation, really focusing on helping those level up who may not otherwise have had a chance or have a different journey.
I'm excited to meet your future mentees.
Me too.
But that's very exciting. So thank you for being here today. I appreciate this conversation. I was able to learn a lot about your role, your life, and honestly just opened my eyes a little bit more about what it takes to keep architecture running, especially like in even like where I work at. I see it differently and see the way that other people outside architecture see architecture. So very good conversation. Thank you for being here.
No, thank you. And I just want to close out and say again, this podcast that you've created here for the last several years, it's a real gift to let people know, hey, I see you, I got you, and we're going to put a spotlight on other stories that are similar to you. I just think it's so important and necessary. So my hat's off to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I want to thank everyone for listening. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can follow us on Instagram at beyondthesurface_designpod or find us at beyondthesurfacepodcast.org. I want to thank our producer, Kayla Kwok, and the Beyond the Surface team for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening to the episode of Beyond the Surface featuring. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Surface featuring Rana Lee. Until next time, goodbye.